Hello, my name is Tony Comanzo, and I'll be going over assignment 3 for my individual project, which was the Family Tree app. To start off, I'm going to discuss the completed user stories as well as the incompleted ones. So out of all the stories from Sprint 1, these are all the stories and they were all completed. So all the stories from Sprint 1 were completed. And so for all these user stories, there were backend and front end components, and all of them were completed. For Sprint 2, um, we have, for the only completed user story we have, as a journal user, I want to be able to add medical history to family members. And in the incomplete user stories, we have quite a few. And for the incompleted user stories, they have been started, and most of them are mostly completed, but they're not 100% complete. And for example, the two user stories, as a general user, I want to be able to add address information to family members, and as a general user, I want to be able to add contact information to family members. Those both have front end and back end components, and the back end components for those two user stories are 100% completed. However, they are not 100% completed in terms of their front end components. And as a general user, I want to be able to see an actual tree representation of my family, and I want to be able to interact with the nodes. So that user story is completed, but it does not contain all the features that were intended. And so in the future, if there was more time, there would be ideally more features that would be a part of that user story. And however, there was not enough time. So that one is not 100% completed, but it has been started. And for the top two incompleted user stories, those two are started but are not finished. For Sprint 3, we have one completed user story. We have, as a general user, I want to be able to add birthdays to my family members. And for the incompleted user stories, we have 3. So the 2 user stories in red, in the dark red, have not been started at all. And the user story, as a general user, I want to be able to share my family tree with other people. That one has been started and it is functional. However, it has not been tested. So it's not clear if there are bugs or if it performs as expected in every scenario. And like I said before, the two user stories in red font are not started at all. And in terms of the plans for the final wrap up, we had one user story, or I had one user story planned, which was to improve the UI. And that one has not been started. However, the user interface isn't that, it is not that hard to use, but there are some things that could be improved. For example, adding success messages at the end of operations so that the user knows that they were successful. For example, creating a new user does not give the user, sorry, creating a new account does not give the user a message saying if there was a failure or if it was a success. And creating a descendant or ancestor does not give a success message to the user. So those are a couple of things that would have been added. And in terms of lessons learned, there were quite a few. So definitely it would have been a good idea to keep your code more modular and try to use language features to make code less redundant. And that's because in a lot of the classes that I use, there is a lot of code that is very similar, and it would have been probably easier in the long run to spend a little bit more time up front kind of preparing some things so that there would be less code written. And I also learned that it's very convenient to use wrapper libraries and rather than the library that they're wrapping. For example, I used SQLite to implement the database on the client on the on the phone. So uh, there's I used client server architecture. There was a database on the client as well as on the server, and so I planned on using SQLite for the client. And originally, I was going to write the SQL, write the code to directly access SQLite myself. But I discovered a library called Room, which is maintained by Google and Android, and it's a wrapper of it wraps the SQLite libraries so that they're a little bit easier to access, and it takes care of uh, it makes things a lot more convenient, and it makes things a lot less prone to errors and bugs during runtime. So in the future, I would definitely use libraries like that. And it also used a lot of code generation, so um, there was a lot of code that I didn't have to write by using this library. So it was very convenient, and I would definitely use it in the future. And I definitely realized that it's very helpful to kind of think out a plan or a design before starting. Um, and for example, it's definitely a good idea to create an entity relationship um, map, an ERM diagram to kind of plan out what the tables are going to be like. But it's also good to be able to go with the flow because um, I had to make a lot of adjustments to the database design. And in the future, though, I'd probably try to make as few database modifications as possible. Um, so I think it would probably be better to spend a little bit more time up front to make a more robust database design. Um, and that's because I did have to make a lot of database modifications as I was making the project or as I was building it. And so that kind of um, that slowed things down a bit, I would say. And I definitely learned, I got a lot of experience designing a system. So I would definitely say that I learned both how to and how not to design a system. And I think that kind of harkens back to a couple of the previous um a couple of the previous points here. For example, using certain language features to make things less redundant, or maybe even using some design patterns to kind of make development a bit more robust or a bit more efficient. Um, so in the future, I definitely keep that in mind. And there were a lot of design patterns I had to learn as I was building the project. For example, model view model, as well as the repository design pattern. And um, yeah. And so in terms of challenges encountered, definitely time management was a big one. Um, and this is a pretty difficult project to work on along with the rest of my coursework. So time management was definitely really important and something I could have worked better on. And figuring out the best way to design everything was also a challenge. And that kind of harkens back to the previous slide when I was discussing how to design a system. And as an example, it was a little bit difficult to decide or figure out the best way to kind of design the repository pattern. And I wasn't really sure which information should be stored on the phone, which information should be stored on the server, and then when the phone and server should try to like communicate and kind of sync their information. Um, it, to be honest, that when I was first designing the project, I had a pretty clear idea of what information would be on the phone and what information would be on the server. But then as I was building the project, it became a little bit less clear um, what the best way to do that would be, and I started to kind of second guess myself a little bit. So um, yeah, that was definitely a challenge. And then another challenge was just general inexperience when it came to Android programming. And so I had experience with Android programming before, but there I was in no way an expert, and there was a lot of things that were still a little bit difficult to learn or to program. And there was a lot of stuff I had to research or kind of Google to figure out how to do. Fortunately, there are a lot of resources online. So, and yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching.